The small town of Pine Valley wasn't used to change. For decades, it had maintained its peaceful charm, where everyone knew their neighbors and the biggest excitement was the annual fall festival. But all that was about to change when a new mayor took office in the spring of 2023. The inauguration ceremony was unlike anything the townspeople had seen before. The new mayor, a successful businessman from the big city, had transformed the modest town hall into something that looked more like a corporate event. Blue and silver balloons filled the room, and expensive catering services offered fancy finger foods that most locals couldn't even pronounce. Pine Valley needs to step into the modern age, the new mayor declared from behind the podium, his designer suit gleaming under the lights. His words echoed through the speakers, making some of the older council members shift uncomfortably in their seats. What worked 20 years ago won't work today. We need innovation, efficiency, and most importantly, change. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some people, especially the younger business owners, clapped enthusiastically. Others, including many longtime residents, exchanged worried glances. But nobody seemed more concerned than the town's police chief, who sat quietly in the front row, watching everything with experienced eyes. The chief had served Pine Valley for over 2 decades, working her way up from a rookie officer to the department's leader. She'd seen mayors come and go, but something about this one felt different. Maybe it was the way he kept talking about corporate solutions for their small town, or how he barely acknowledged the existing town staff during his speech. As the mayor continued his grand promises, the chief noticed something that others might have missed. Every time he mentioned modernization or efficiency, his eyes would drift to the police department's section. It wasn't hard to guess what was coming. She'd heard through the grapevine that he considered law enforcement outdated in their town. The reception after the ceremony proved even more revealing. While most department heads were trying to introduce themselves to their new boss, the mayor spent most of his time with a group of out-of-town businessmen. The chief overheard fragments of their conversation: private contracts, budget restructuring, and personnel changes. That evening, as she sat in her office reviewing the day's events, the chief pulled out her worn leather notebook, the same one she used to solve countless cases over the years. On a fresh page, she wrote down her observations and concerns. Years of police work had taught her to trust her instincts, and right now, those instincts were telling her to prepare for a storm. Looking around her office at the photos of graduating police academy classes, community outreach events, and ceremonies honoring fallen officers, she felt a deep responsibility. These weren't just pictures on a wall, they represented real people, real service, and real commitment to the community. The next morning, the chief arrived at work earlier than usual. She wasn't surprised to find several emails from the new mayor already waiting in her inbox. The first one requested immediate access to all department protocols and staffing information. The second demanded a meeting that same afternoon to discuss critical efficiency improvements. As she sipped her coffee, black, no sugar, just like she'd had it since her first day on the force, she couldn't help but smile slightly. The new mayor might be used to running a business where his word was law, but he was about to learn that running a police department, especially in a town like Pine Valley, required more than just corporate strategies and PowerPoint presentations. The chief began preparing for the meeting, gathering facts, figures, and most importantly, the legal frameworks that governed their operations. If the new mayor wanted to talk about changes, she'd make sure he understood exactly what he was dealing with. After all, her job wasn't to win popularity contests or make splashy headlines. It was to keep Pine Valley and its people safe, and she intended to do exactly that. Little did either of them know this was just the beginning of a story that would shake their small town to its core, testing loyalties, challenging principles, and ultimately showing that true power doesn't always come from the top. The morning sun hadn't even properly warmed the police station when the new mayor burst through the front doors. The desk sergeant, who'd been calmly sorting through morning reports, nearly spilled his coffee at the southern entrance. Without so much as a good morning, the mayor marched straight toward the chief's office, his expensive shoes clicking against the worn linoleum floors. The chief was reviewing overnight incident reports when her office door swung open. She didn't look up immediately. 25 years on the force had taught her that sometimes the best response was no response at all. Instead, she finished reading the sentence about a missing cat that had been found in old Mrs. Henderson's garage. "I've been trying to reach you all morning," the mayor announced, dropping a thick folder onto her desk. His face was flushed, though whether from anger or from climbing the station stairs wasn't clear. The chief finally looked up, her expression calm and professional. "Good morning, Mr. Mayor. I was actually about to call you back. I was handling an early morning situation at the high school." This wasn't entirely true. She'd been giving him time to cool down after his barrage of urgent messages, but sometimes diplomacy required small omissions. The mayor wasn't interested in pleasantries. He pulled out a stack of papers from his folder, graphs, charts, and what appeared to be a completely redesigned organizational chart for the police department. "I spent the week analyzing your department's operations," he said, spreading the papers across her desk like a card dealer at a casino. "The inefficiencies are worse than I thought." The chief picked up one of the papers, noting how the mayor had highlighted response times in angry red marker. "I see you've been busy," she said, keeping her voice neutral. "Though I'm curious why you didn't come to me first for some of this information." "Because I needed an unbiased view," he replied, pulling out more documents. "Look at these numbers. Your department's budget is 15% higher than similar-sized towns in the region. Your patrol routes are inefficient, and don't even get me started on your overtime costs." The chief listened patiently, years of dealing with heated domestic disputes coming in handy. When the mayor finally paused for breath, she reached into her desk drawer and pulled out her own folder, one she'd prepared after their first meeting. "Those are interesting observations," she said, opening her folder. "But there are some crucial factors you might not be aware of." She pulled out a map of the town. "Those similar-sized towns you mentioned, they don't have 3 major highways intersecting through them, or a regional shopping center that doubles our daytime population." The mayor waved his hand dismissively. "Details. What matters is the bottom line. I've already drafted new protocols that will streamline everything." He pulled out another document, this one titled Police Department Modernization Initiative. The chief skimmed the document, her concern growing with each paragraph. "Mr. Mayor, some of these changes would violate state law. For instance, you can't produce minimum staffing levels below state requirements. And these response time targets, they'd require our officers to break speed limits on residential streets." "Laws can be changed," the mayor said confidently. "I've already spoken to some friends on the state level." "And this proposal to eliminate the community outreach program," the chief continued, "that would violate our federal grant requirements. We'd have to return over $200,000 in funding." The mayor's face reddened further. He clearly wasn't used to having his ideas challenged. "The private sector doesn't waste time with feel-good programs. We need results, not coffee with seniors and reading to kids." The chief stood up slowly, her full height matching the mayor's. "Those feel-good programs have reduced juvenile crime by 40% over the past 3 years. They've helped us solve dozens of cases through community tips, and they're the reason we have one of the highest community trust ratings in the state." She walked to her office window, gesturing to the street below. "See that coffee shop? Last month, the owner called us because she recognized a suspect from our community bulletin. That tip helped us solve a string of burglaries. That's not inefficiency, Mr. Mayor. That's community policing at its finest." The mayor gathered his papers, his movements sharp with frustration. "I didn't come here for a debate. I came to inform you of changes that will be implemented. I expect your full cooperation." As he reached for the door handle, the chief spoke again, her voice quiet but firm. "Mr. Mayor, I respect your position, but I took an oath to serve and protect this community according to the law. Any changes we make must follow proper procedures and legal requirements." The mayor paused, his back to her. "You know," he said, his voice carrying a hint of threat, "in the corporate world, resistance to change usually leads to career adjustments." The chief smiled slightly, though there was no humor in it. "Good thing we're not in the corporate world then. This is public service, Mr. Mayor, and here the rules are a bit different." After the mayor left, the chief sat back down at her desk. She pulled out her notebook again, carefully documenting the entire conversation. Something told her she'd need these notes sooner rather than later. Looking at her phone, she saw 3 missed calls from the city council president. Seems like the mayor's modernization plans were already making waves. She reached for her coffee mug, now cold, and couldn't help but chuckle. The mayor might think he was playing chess, but he didn't realize he walked into a game where she knew every piece on the board. The real question was, what would his next move be? Over the next few weeks, Pine Valley's police station felt more like a pressure cooker than a workplace. The mayor had launched what he called his Department Transparency Initiative, but everyone knew it was really about undermining the chief's authority. It started with small things. The local newspaper suddenly began receiving anonymous tips about response times and budget overruns. The chief would arrive at work to find reporters waiting in the parking lot, asking about statistics that had been cherry-picked to paint the department in the worst possible light. Chief called out one of the veteran officers one morning, holding up the local paper. "Have you seen this?" The headline read, "Police Department Wastes Taxpayer Money on Coffee and Cookies." The article criticized their community outreach programs, completely ignoring how these programs had helped solve crimes and build trust. The chief took the paper, scanning it quickly. "Interesting how they left out the part about our crime rate being at a 10-year low," she said, keeping her voice steady despite her frustration. "Keep focusing on your work. The truth has a way of coming out." But the mayor wasn't done. He began scheduling crucial budget meetings at times when he knew the chief would be handling other commitments. When she sent her deputy to represent the department, the mayor would claim she was delegating her responsibilities and showing lack of commitment. The real shock came when the mayor tried to install his own person as deputy chief, a former security consultant from his business days. The chief discovered this plan when she overheard two council members discussing it in the town hall parking lot. She immediately pulled out the city charter, which clearly stated that all senior police appointments needed to go through proper channels and required specific law enforcement experience. During a particularly tense staff meeting, one of the younger officers spoke up. "Chief, the mayor's people have been asking us to report directly to them about department operations. They're saying it's part of the new streamlined communication process." The chief looked around the room at her officers. She could see the worry in their faces, the uncertainty about their futures. These weren't just employees. They were public servants who dedicated their lives to protecting their community. "Listen up," she said, standing at the front of the room. "I know things are tough right now, but remember why we wear this badge. It's not for the mayor or for me or even for the department. It's for the people of this town. Keep doing your jobs the right way and document everything. That's all I ask." After the meeting, the chief spent hours updating her growing file of incidents and irregularities. She noted how the mayor had tried to access confidential case files without proper authorization, how he'd attempted to change patrol schedules without consulting shift supervisors, how he'd threatened to cut the K-9 unit despite its crucial role in drug prevention at the high school. The situation reached a new level when the department's community liaison officer came to her office, clearly troubled. "Chief, you need to see this," he said, placing a flyer on her desk. It was an announcement for a town hall meeting about modernizing local law enforcement. The kicker? Neither she nor any member of the department had been informed about it. The chief attended the meeting anyway, sitting quietly in the back. She watched as the mayor presented his vision for a 21st-century police force, complete with privatized services and reduced community programs. What caught her attention, though, was how he kept referring to a specific security consulting firm. That evening, as she was leaving the station, she noticed a familiar car in the town hall parking lot. It belonged to the CEO of that same security firm the mayor had been promoting. Through the window, she could see them having what appeared to be a very animated discussion. The chief pulled out her phone and snapped a few discreet photos. She'd learned long ago that timing and documentation were everything in law enforcement. As she drove home that night, she couldn't help but wonder about all these coincidences: the mayor's push to privatize services, his relationship with the security firm, the rushed proposals. Her phone buzzed with a text from one of her longtime contacts in the state attorney's office. "Got your message. Very interesting pattern you're seeing. Keep documenting. Might be more here than just bad management." The chief smiled slightly. The mayor might be good at corporate power plays, but he was about to learn that in law enforcement, patience and procedure often won out over flash and force. She had a feeling the next few weeks would be very interesting indeed. That night, she added one more entry to her notebook. Sometimes the biggest crimes aren't the ones committed in dark alleys, but in bright offices with expensive furniture. The pieces were starting to come together, and she had a feeling the mayor's efficiency campaign was about to backfire in ways he never expected. The breaking point came on a rainy Tuesday morning. The chief was reviewing reports when her computer screen suddenly went black. Across the station, other officers were experiencing the same thing. The department's entire computer system had been shut down on the mayor's direct orders. It's for a complete system audit, the mayor's office claimed in a hastily sent email. All operations will need to be conducted manually until further notice. The timing couldn't have been worse. The department was in the middle of coordinating security for the upcoming town festival, their biggest annual event. The chief stood in the middle of the station, watching her officers adapt to the situation. They'd pulled out old paper forms and dusted off analog radios. Some of the younger officers had never worked without the computer system, but the veterans were showing them the ropes. Despite the mayor's attempt to cripple their operations, the department kept running. "You know what this reminds me of?" said one of the older officers, grinning as he dug through a filing cabinet. "That big storm 10 years ago, when we lost power for 3 days. We still kept this town safe then, and we'll do it now." But the computer shutdown was just the beginning. Later that afternoon, the chief received an urgent message from the city council. The mayor had called an emergency budget meeting and was proposing an immediate 30% cut to the police department's funding. The reason? Critical fiscal restructuring for modernization. When the chief arrived at City Hall, she found the council chambers packed. The mayor stood at the podium, looking more like a CEO giving a shareholders' presentation than a public servant. Behind him, a sleek digital display showed graphs and charts that painted a dire picture of police spending. "Ladies and gentlemen of the council," the mayor began, his voice carrying that practiced corporate smoothness. "I've discovered alarming inefficiencies in our police department's budget. The numbers don't lie. We're spending too much for too little return." The chief listened from her seat, taking careful notes. The mayor's presentation was clever. He'd combined unrelated statistics to create a false narrative. He compared their department's budget to towns with half their population, ignored their special programs' success rates, and completely overlooked their regional responsibilities. But what really caught her attention was a small detail in one of his slides. In the corner of his proposed solutions presentation was a tiny logo, the same one she'd seen on business cards at the security firm's office. The pieces were starting to fit together. During the public comment period, longtime residents stood up to defend their police department. The owner of the local diner talked about how community policing had helped clean up the dangerous corner near his business. A high school teacher praised the school resource officer who had prevented a potential tragedy. An elderly woman described how the department's senior check-in program had saved her life during last winter's freeze. The mayor seemed increasingly agitated as more people spoke in support of the department. He kept checking his phone, sending quick texts when he thought no one was watching. The chief noticed he seemed particularly nervous when anyone mentioned the department's successful community programs. Just as the mayor was about to call for a vote on the budget cuts, the back doors of the council chambers opened. In walked a familiar face, the CEO of the private security firm the mayor had been meeting with. But instead of joining the mayor at the front, he took a seat near the exit, looking uncomfortable. The chief's phone buzzed quietly in her pocket. It was a message from her contact at the state attorney's office. "Don't let him take that vote. We're almost ready." Standing up, the chief addressed the council. "Before you vote, I believe there are some relevant facts about this proposal that deserve investigation, specifically the connection between these cuts and certain private contracts being negotiated without proper oversight." The mayor's face went pale. "That's completely out of line," he snapped. "This is about efficiency, nothing more." "Is it?" the chief asked calmly. She pulled out her notebook. "Then you won't mind explaining why you've had 7 private meetings with Blue Line Security Services in the past month, or why their consulting fees are already listed in next quarter's budget, even though no contract has been approved." The council chambers erupted in murmurs. The security firm CEO quietly slipped out the back door. The mayor gripped the podium, his knuckles white. "This is a smear campaign," he declared. "I'm trying to save this town money by replacing our experienced officers with private security guards who have minimal training and no community connection." The chief countered. "Or is it about the board position you've been promised once your term ends?" The mayor's face went from pale to red. He gathered his papers quickly, almost dropping them in his haste. "This meeting is adjourned," he announced, but the council president shook her head. "Actually, Mr. Mayor, given these allegations, I believe we need to continue this discussion, and perhaps invite some state oversight officials to join us." As if on cue, two suited individuals entered the chamber, badges visible on their belts. The chief recognized them from the state's ethics commission. The mayor looked like he might be sick. The chief sat back down, watching as years of police work taught her something valuable. Sometimes the biggest cases solve themselves if you just gather enough evidence and wait for the right moment. The next few days in Pine Valley felt like watching a carefully constructed house of cards collapse. The state ethics investigators set up shop in a conference room at City Hall, their presence sending ripples through the usually quiet building. One by one, they called in various city employees, council members, and anyone else who might have information about the mayor's dealings. The chief sat in her office, reviewing her detailed notes from the past few months. Every meeting, every unusual request, every attempted policy change, it was all there, documented with the same attention to detail she used throughout her career. A knock at her door made her look up. "Come in," she called out, recognizing one of the state investigators. The investigator, a seasoned professional with gray at his temples, settled into the chair across from her desk. "Chief," he began, pulling out a notebook of his own, "I have to say, your documentation is impressive. 20 years in this job, and I've rarely seen such thorough records." She smiled slightly. "When you've been in law enforcement as long as I have, you learn that the best evidence is often just paying attention and writing things down." The investigator nodded, flipping through his notes. "We've been doing some digging into Blue Line Security Services. Interesting company. Seems they have a pattern of approaching small towns, promising big savings through privatization. Usually works with newly elected officials who don't understand municipal operations." "And the board position they offered our mayor?" the chief asked. "Oh, that's just the tip of the iceberg," the investigator replied, laying out several documents. "We found emails discussing not just a board position, but stock auctions, consulting fees, and a percentage of any contracts awarded. Your mayor was setting himself up for quite a comfortable post-office career." The chief leaned back in her chair, thinking about all the times the mayor had talked about modernization and efficiency. It had never been about improving the department, it was about setting up his own golden parachute. Out in the station, life continued as normal. Officers went about their duties, responding to calls, helping citizens, keeping the peace. But there was a different energy now. The uncertainty of the past months had been replaced by a quiet confidence. The investigation expanded beyond just the mayor's dealings with Blue Line. The state team discovered that the computer system shutdown had been an attempt to hide evidence of unauthorized access to confidential police files. The mayor had been looking for anything he could use against the department. "You know what's ironic?" said the desk sergeant one morning as he and the chief watched another group of investigators arrive. "All his talk about waste and inefficiency, and now we've got a dozen state officials spending who knows how much taxpayer money investigating him." The chief nodded. Sometimes the most expensive thing in government is corruption disguised as cost-cutting. As the investigation continued, more details emerged. The cherry-picked statistics the mayor had used in his presentations. They'd been deliberately manipulated. The similar towns he compared them to. They'd been carefully selected to make Pine Valley's police budget look bloated. But what really caught the investigators' attention was the money trail. They discovered that the mayor had already signed preliminary agreements with Blue Line, promising them access to confidential police data and guaranteeing them future contracts, all without council approval or public knowledge. One afternoon, the chief received a call from the state attorney's office. "We're going to need you to testify before the grand jury," the prosecutor said. "Your records provide the timeline we need to show this wasn't just bad judgment, it was a deliberate scheme." The chief agreed, but as she hung up the phone, she felt no satisfaction. This wasn't about winning or losing. It was about protecting the integrity of public service and the safety of her community. That evening, as she walked through the station, she stopped to watch her officers at work. The young rookie patiently helping an elderly resident file a report. The veteran detective reviewing cold cases in hopes of bringing closure to old wounds. The dispatch operator calmly coordinating responses to multiple calls. This was what real public service looked like, not flashy presentations or promises of easy solutions, but dedicated people doing their best to serve their community day after day. Her phone buzzed with another update from the investigation team. They'd found more emails, more evidence of the mayor's plans. But the chief was already thinking ahead. Once this was over, there would be work to do. Rebuilding trust, strengthening oversight, ensuring something like this couldn't happen again. As she headed home that night, she passed the town's welcome sign, Pine Valley, where community matters. Sometimes, she reflected, it takes a crisis to remind people what really matters. And sometimes, the best way to fight corruption isn't with dramatic confrontations, but with patient, persistent dedication to doing things the right way. The town hall was packed like never before. Every seat was taken, and people lined the walls, some even sitting on the floor. The emergency council meeting had been called with just 24 hours' notice, but word had spread fast in Pine Valley. Everyone knew something big was about to happen. The mayor sat at his usual place, but gone was his usual confident posture. His expensive suit looked rumpled, and dark circles under his eyes suggested sleepless nights. He kept glancing at his phone, which hadn't stopped buzzing since he arrived. The chief sat quietly in her usual spot, a thick folder on the table in front of her. She'd spent the morning preparing for this moment, though truthfully, the evidence would speak for itself. Around her, she could feel the tension in the room, like the air before a storm. The council president called the meeting to order, her voice steady but serious. Before we begin, I want to remind everyone that this is still an official council meeting. We will maintain order and proper decorum. She paused, looking directly at the crowd. That said, what we're about to discuss concerns every citizen of Pine Valley. The state investigators stepped forward, setting up their presentation. The lead investigator, a no-nonsense professional with decades of experience, began laying out their findings. As he spoke, documents appeared on the large screen behind him: emails, contracts, bank records, meeting notes. Over the past 3 months, our office has conducted a thorough investigation into several concerning patterns of behavior, the investigator began. What we uncovered was more than just irregular procedure. We found evidence of a coordinated effort to dismantle the police department for private gain. The room erupted in murmurs. The mayor shifted in his seat, loosening his tie. The evidence was damning. Emails showed the mayor had been in talks with Blue Line Security Services months before taking office. There were draft contracts, already signed but dated for future months, promising to hand over police operations to the private company. Most shocking were the financial documents showing a complex web of future payments, stock options, and consulting fees, all tied to the mayor's cooperation in privatizing the department. In this email, the investigator continued, highlighting a particular message. The mayor discusses ways to artificially inflate police department costs to justify outsourcing. He specifically mentions creating crisis scenarios to undermine public confidence in the department. The computer system shutdown, the budget cuts, the negative press, it had all been part of a calculated plan. Even the community outreach programs had been targeted because they were too successful, making it harder to justify privatization. A longtime council member stood up, her voice shaking with anger. Are you telling us that our mayor deliberately tried to damage our police department just to set himself up for a cushy private sector job? The investigator nodded grimly. The evidence suggests exactly that. The mayor suddenly jumped to his feet. This is ridiculous. Everything I did was for the good of this town. You're all too stuck in the past to see that private sector solutions are the future. The chief finally spoke up, her voice calm but carrying to every corner of the room. Mr. Mayor, would you like to explain these text messages? She nodded to the investigator, who pulled up a new screen. There were the mayor's own words, discussing how to create problems that only privatization could solve. The crowd's reaction was immediate. Gasps turned to angry mutters. A retired officer in the back of the room stood up, his face red with fury, but the chief caught his eye and subtly shook her head. This wasn't the time for emotional outbursts. The truth was doing all the work for them. The mayor's phone buzzed again. He glanced at it, and his face fell even further. The local news had already picked up the story. His carefully crafted image was crumbling in real time. "There's more," the investigator continued. "We found evidence of similar schemes in other towns. Blue Line's pattern was consistent: find ambitious local politicians, promise them future positions, and help them manufacture crises to justify privatization." The council president called for order as the room erupted again. "Given the severity of these findings," she announced, "I am calling for an immediate vote of no confidence in the mayor's leadership." The mayor grabbed his briefcase, papers spilling out as he stood. "This is a witch hunt. You're all going to regret this. My lawyers will." "Your lawyers have already been provided with copies of all evidence," the state investigator cut in. "They received them this morning. I believe they're trying to reach you now." He nodded toward the mayor's still buzzing phone. As the mayor stormed out of the chamber, the chief watched him go. She felt no joy, no satisfaction. Only a deep relief that the truth had finally come to light. Around her, citizens were hugging, some crying, others just sitting in shocked silence as they processed what they'd learned. A young officer leaned over to her. "Chief, we just got word. The mayor's trying to leave town. Should we?" The chief shook her head. "The state investigators have that covered. Our job is to keep doing what we've always done, protecting this community." As the meeting continued, with council members discussing next steps and emergency measures, the chief thought about all the small moments that had led to this day. Every careful note she'd taken, every piece of evidence she'd documented, every time she'd chosen patience over confrontation, it had all mattered in the end. The truth didn't always need dramatic revelations or shocking confrontations. Sometimes it just needed people willing to stand their ground and do things the right way, one day at a time. The autumn leaves were just starting to turn when Pine Valley began to heal from its summer of turmoil. The former mayor's resignation letter had been brief, just 3 sentences acknowledging his immediate departure for personal reasons. He didn't mention the pending ethics violations or the state's ongoing investigation into his dealings with Blue Line Security Services. The chief stood at her office window, watching kids walk to school along streets patrolled by her officers. The morning sun caught their badges, small flashes of light that represented so much more than authority. They represented trust, service, and commitment to community. "Chief." A knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts. It was one of her veteran officers, holding the morning paper. "You might want to see this." The headline read, "Former Mayor Pleads Guilty to Ethics Violations." The article detailed how he'd accepted a plea deal, admitting to conspiracy and abuse of power. Blue Line Security Services was facing its own investigation, with similar schemes being uncovered in other small towns across the state. "Well," the chief said, setting down the paper, "I guess that's that." But she knew it wasn't really the end, it was more like a new beginning. The changes came gradually but meaningfully. The city council, chastened by how close they'd come to losing their police department, passed new oversight measures. Every major policy change now required public hearings. Contract bids had to be transparent, with detailed documentation of all meetings and discussions. But the real changes were happening at the ground level. The community outreach programs, once targeted for elimination, were now being expanded. The senior check-in service added more volunteers. The school resource officer program became a model for other departments in the region. One morning, the chief arrived at work to find an elderly woman waiting in the lobby. She recognized her from the council meeting where everything had come to light. "I just wanted to thank you," the woman said, her eyes bright with emotion. "My grandson, he always wanted to be a police officer. But lately, with all the negative stories about law enforcement, he was having doubts. What happened here? How you stood up for what's right. It showed him that good police work isn't about power or control. It's about serving people." The chief listened, touched by the woman's words. Later that day, she shared the story during the morning briefing. "Remember this," she told her officers. "What we do matters. Not just the big moments, but every small interaction, every act of kindness, every time we choose to do things the right way." The station itself felt different now. Officers walked with renewed purpose. The community's support, which had always been strong, grew even stronger. Citizens would stop by with coffee, homemade cookies, or just to say thank you. The state investigator's final report became required reading at the police academy, a case study in how corruption can threaten public institutions and how dedication to proper procedure and community service can defeat it. One officer, reviewing the report, shook his head in amazement. "You know what gets me, Chief? He really thought he could just walk in here with his corporate playbook and take over. He never understood what we really do." The chief smiled. Sometimes people in power forget that real authority doesn't come from titles or offices. It comes from trust, earned day by day, call by call, service by service. The fall festival came around again, just like it always did. The chief watched her officers work the crowd, helping lost children find their parents, directing traffic, chatting with vendors. These weren't just police duties, they were community connections, each one a tiny thread in the fabric that held Pine Valley together. A group of kids ran past, plastic badges pinned to their shirts, playing cops and robbers. The chief chuckled. Some things never changed. But maybe these kids would grow up understanding that real police work wasn't about power struggles or dramatic confrontations. It was about something much simpler and much more important, serving others. Late that evening, as the festival wound down and the last families headed home, the chief did a final walk through the quiet streets. A young officer fell into step beside her. "You know," he said, "when all that stuff with the mayor was happening, I was pretty worried. Thought maybe he'd win, that everything would change." The chief nodded, understanding his concern. "Change isn't always bad," she replied. "But the key is making sure it's change for the right reasons, done the right way." Back at the station, she found her old notebook, the one that had documented everything. She added one final entry. Sometimes the biggest victory isn't in defeating someone who's wrong, but in showing others what's right. The next morning, as she drove to work, the chief passed the town's welcome sign. Below it, someone had added a new banner, "Pine Valley, where community comes first." She smiled, knowing that while their story might be over, their real work, the daily task of serving and protecting their community, would continue one day at a time, just as it always had.